Because I can never shoot the core enough times. Same name, different game, Gradius III. Hi, I'm Joe, and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. You know, I've been at this making videos on the internet thing for almost 10 years now. That's a long time. It's almost a third of my life, in fact. On May 3rd, 2007, I posted the first video on my YouTube channel. And since then, I have been talking about mostly video games, with shoot-em-ups being one of the real constants here, since it's a genre that I truly love. And so hey, as we move into that 11th year, I felt like a shoot-em-up was the only way to go. So before I get too self-indulgent, let's do a little history on Gradius III. We've covered the history of Gradius and Life Force quite a bit here, but after those games, Gradius II, Gopher no Yabo, translated as Gopher's Ambition, hit arcades in 1988. The series was producing hit after hit, both in arcades and the home market, and Gradius II was released on the Famicom and several home computers, but never got a Western home release. The next year, in 1989, Gradius III Densetsu Kara Shinwa A, translated From Legend to Myth, hit arcades. Near as I can tell, Gradius III never hit American arcades. There's no US flyer, there are no examples of US cabinets that I've seen anywhere. So it wasn't until 2000 that the US got its first taste of arcade Gradius III as part of the Gradius 3 and 4 compilation disc for the PlayStation 2. This came out shortly after the system's launch both in Japan and North America. The game is also available to US audiences on the Gradius Collection for PSP, but for this episode I used this version, and the reason for that is that it has some extra bells and whistles that the original arcade version did not have, but we will get to those later. At its core, get it? Core?
Destroy the core!
Anyways, it is an emulation of the arcade cabinet. Konami made some good-looking games in their heyday, and this one is no exception. The stages all look cool, and the music from the Konami Kukeiha Club may not be their best work, but it's better than most video game music of the day, as was usually the case with the Kukeiha Club. From an audiovisual perspective, this game is fantastic for 1989. This game features the typical Gradius power-up system, where you grab capsules that build up a meter, and you press a button to select the weapon you want when you have enough of them. Seen here to complement that is the Weapon Select, which first appeared in Gradius II, and the Weapon Edit, making its debut in the series. The former allows you to choose from several preset weapon loadouts. The latter allows you to choose one item from each category of the power meter, but the catch is that some weapons are only available in the Weapon Select, and some are only available in the Edit mode. So how badly do you want that spread bomb if it means you're stuck with the Ripple Laser? How much do you want to use the E-Laser if it means you can't have the spread bomb? A lot of these stages are similar to stages from Gradius II, but by the time most Americans played the game, whether on the Super NES or the PS2, Gradius II hadn't seen the light of day here, so they felt fresh to a large part of the audience. And some are brand new. The first stage, for example, is a desert planet with sand lions and dragons that attack you. The second stage is possibly the one most associated with this game, the Bubble Stage. In fact, series director Machiguchi Hiroyasu said in a 1996 interview translated by shmuplations.com that the bubble stage was something they'd wanted to do since the original Gradius, but the hardware just wasn't there yet, so they weren't able to implement it until Gradius III. The game also has the trademark Moai stage, and even a stage that calls to mind Life Force. But it has one thing that no other game in the series has: a level in the mold of the Sega Super Scalar arcade games like Afterburner. It's the 4th stage, and it's kind of a bonus stage. There are no enemies, just power capsules to pick up, but it's also very fast-paced, so it's easy to crash into the walls and lose a bunch of your lives, which is really obnoxious for a bonus stage.
And that's where we hit the big issue with this game: the difficulty. Gradius III in the arcade is one of the most relentlessly difficult games I have ever played in my life. And get this, in the arcade, on an actual arcade cabinet, you can't continue at all. Once you lose all your ships, you go back to stage 1.
And that bubble stage I mentioned? It's crazy difficult. I'd wager a lot of people never saw past this stage. It's pull your hair out, throw your controller, just go play something else difficult. It's more difficult than a few of the stages that follow it. It's a total brick wall, which is bizarre, because while the first stage isn't exactly a walk in the park, a reasonably skilled player can clear it on their first credit on the default difficulty. But stage 2, these bubbles, they broke me. I turned the difficulty down all the way, which is something I'm sure no arcade operator would have done, just so I could finish it. And let me tell you, even on the very easy difficulty, this game is the kind of challenge that would make a Dark Souls fan say, You will die in this game. A lot. And if that's the thing that turns you off, I'd say avoid this version of it, because I'm not joking when I say it took me over 2 hours to clear stage 2 of this game, and I'm no slouch when it comes to shoot-em-ups of this vintage.
But in spite of its crushing difficulty, it was clearly a success, because in 1990, it got ported to the Super Famicom in Japan. And in 1991, this tough-as-nails shooter hit the American Super NES as a launch title. This is the only true port that this game ever got, so how does it fare?
Now you might think the title Gradius III would be confusing to US audiences because they didn't do any Final Fantasy nonsense and call this Gradius II, but speaking for myself, my friends and I just always assumed Life Force was Gradius II. This does of course explain why the intro is different, since the arcade intro goes over the history of the series, and the SNES instead has a pretty cool cinematic of the Vic Viper launching. Though the Japanese Super Famicom version has that too, so maybe Konami just thought this was cooler. At any rate, this version is a bit more forgiving, first and foremost because the hardware of the SNES was great, but couldn't quite handle the full arcade experience, so there are fewer enemies. And infamously, the game slows down. A lot. There's a reason the TurboGrafx and Genesis were known for their shooters a lot more than the Super NES was, and it's because of the system's slower processor speed. This isn't all bad though, as it makes the bubble stage a breeze compared to the arcade version. And while the arcade version does slow down a bit, it's nothing like this. Furthermore, this version gives you continues. What a concept, let the player continue. And when you do continue, you pick up at the last checkpoint, not the beginning of a stage. Of course, you only get 3 continues, but this version also includes a code for a boatload of extra lives, which makes things a lot easier. Still, while it's not a piece of cake, this version feels closer to tough but fair, not like the arcade's feeling of, these developers hate you.
But there's a lot more to the changes than just fewer on-screen enemies and now you can continue. The change in hardware necessitated that.
Gone, of course, is the Super Scalar style bonus stage, but also gone is the Life Force style stage. But it's not just deleted, it's replaced by a sped up stage, which other games in this series and the Parodius series would feature as well. The arcade sort of had this in a Life Force style escape sequence at the end of the final stage, but here it's expanded into its own full level and given a brand new boss not seen in the arcade. This would leave the Super NES at 9 stages to the arcade's 10, but the Super NES version adds 5 hidden bonus stages to make up for the lack of the one in the arcade. To access the first one, for example, fly into this gap in Stage 2. Now you're in a stage very reminiscent of Stage 2 in the original Gradius, but with no enemies. So some stages are cut and some new ones are added, but there are also changes to the levels that are carried over. There are small things all over the place, like the sand lions missing from Stage 1, or the giant moai heads that distribute smaller moais throughout that stage in the arcade version. They're gone in the home port. But there are major things, like Stage 3, the cave stage, having about a quarter of it cut out in the Super NES. Some of the bosses are also changed. These range from minor, like when the first boss's spiders are changed to whatever these things are, to major, where the entire moai boss is changed, going from a short battle against a single floating head, then facing 6 of them on the walls, floor, and ceiling, spitting smaller ones that get larger when you shoot them, to 2 very large stone faces spitting smaller moai that shoot at you, while there are earthquakes that cause rocks to fall from the ceiling. This version also adds blue power capsules, which destroy all enemies on screen. If you've played other games in the series, you're probably familiar with these, but oddly, they're not in the arcade version of Gradius III. Or, if they are, I certainly didn't see any. The last noteworthy changes are to the weapons. For starters, the basic weapon loadouts are changed slightly. The second and third loadouts are the same, but trade the missile. The fourth loadout has totally different double selections. The edit mode changes quite a bit, adding 2 more options for, well, options, and 2 new selections for the exclamation point slot while removing the standard depowering choice. 2 of the double choices are changed for the Super NES version, and in the missile setting, Control, which moves up and down with your ship, becomes Hawk Wind, which either goes up or down depending on which half of the screen you're on, and is honestly more worthwhile.
You know, for what at first blush seems like a straight-up arcade port, the SNES version ends up changing quite a bit, and I tend to think for the better. But wait, there's more. As I said at the top of this episode, when the US finally got their first official taste of the Gradius III arcade version, it was on the PS2. And that was in the form of a slightly enhanced version.
This is an emulated version, but it's done really well and adds a couple of bells and whistles. Remember when I mentioned that the arcade version had some slowdown? Well, the PS2 version lets you turn that on and off. It's also, thankfully, mercifully added a stage select. While you can't truly continue just like the arcade game, whenever you hit a checkpoint, it's added to the stage select menu, so you can pick up at the start of a stage or right where you left off, which is great. Because, as is so often the case with Gradius games, sometimes a checkpoint leaves you in a pretty tight spot as far as power-ups go, so you can start a stage fresh to get those front-loaded power capsules. Also, once you beat the game or play for 10 hours, you get some more weapons added to the edit mode. Beat it again or play for 20 hours, you get even more. There are also some small extra modes added, including the ability to replay 2 stages from earlier games in the series right from the main menu.
Overall, if you're going to play the arcade version of Gradius III, this is the way to do it. Now, there is, as I said before, the Gradius collection on PSP, but the version on here does not contain any of the enhancements I just mentioned on the PS2 version, except for the slowdown setting. But everything else, including continues and extra weapons and all that stuff, is not on the PSP. And they both cost about the same amount in the aftermarket. Between 20 and 30 bucks is what you can expect to pay. You could argue that the PSP version does have 3 extra Gradius games, including the excellent Gradius Gaiden, so I guess there's an argument to be made there. Plus, it's available as a download on the PlayStation Network for just 20 bucks. Obviously, I solved this problem by just having both. Anyways, let's take a look and a listen at the arcade and Super NES versions side by side.
Visually, they're honestly pretty close, no mean feat for the Super NES. From an audio perspective, the Super Nintendo version features some different music tracks, and I honestly like that soundtrack a little better, though it does lose most of the voices, typically the ones telling you what to shoot on the bosses.
And that makes it time to give the edge, and I'll be honest, for me, it's an easy win for the Super NES version. The Super Scalar stage is cool, but it's ultimately a novelty, which is why it never came back in later Gradius games. The Life Force stage is fine, but it's a retread of something from an earlier game. The Speed Up stage that replaces it here was something new for the series at the time, but the biggest thing, as I've already said numerous times, is the difficulty. This version moderates that quite a bit. The arcade version, even with the concessions made by the PS2 version, will have you tearing your hair out by the roots. If you have hair to tear out. Super NES version is available in the aftermarket for less than $20, less than 10 if you're vigilant, and hey, at a flat rate of 8 on the original Wii Virtual Console, where it is still available as of this recording. And that does it. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you'll join me again next month, because it's going to be the 50th episode of Same Name Different Game, and I have something very special planned. Hope to see you then. So long.